Thank you, Caroline and Kelly and Micah and Chris. And it's nice to see Micah got out of timeout over here. Our youngest is John, and he turned 5 on the 15th of this month. And it's kind of hard to believe that 5 years have already passed, but birthdays are not that, they're of note, but they're not of huge consequence necessarily in our family. We don't do a whole lot of stuff for a birthday, but we will go out to eat, but only to the finest restaurants. And so, anyway, we took John to Dario's, and so we have gotten our order, and we are sitting at the table and waiting for the food to be ready. And so it finally is. We get it, we divvy it out, and so we say, who's going to say the blessing? And John is a frequent want to say the blessing, and most of the time the blessing for him looks like this. God, Jesus, thank you, church, Mama, Daddy, Amen, and that's what kind of looks like most of the time. Anyway, but this is his birthday, and so we say, who wants to say the blessing? He's the first to say it, but even if he wasn't, because it's his birthday, he wants to say the blessing. Fine, John, you say the blessing. Okay. So John, he bows his head, and he pauses. Happy birthday to John. My favorite blessing so far. Anyway, but in John's mind, when the question is, say the blessing, or what does it mean to say the blessing on your birthday? Well, in his mind, it means that you sing happy birthday to yourself. If you ask someone else that question, likely you'll get a different answer. It might be something along the lines of actually thanking God for meeting our needs. But if you ask him, that's the answer that you will get. You know, it's interesting that the answer to a question is often varied by who is answering the question. Throughout this month, we have been thinking about a number of regular, normal aspects of our life. At first, we talked about time. We all have time. We all have some money. We all have giftedness. We all have these things, just like everybody else in the world. We all have these things. But we've been thinking about it through this lens, that my relationship with Christ, if it does do what the Bible says, which that it changes everything, it ought to impact how I use my time. It ought to impact the use of my money. It ought to impact the use of my giftedness. And one of the words that we haven't used throughout this series that in truth undergirds everything that we have said is this word, stewardship. Stewardship. Stewardship of time, stewardship of resources, stewardship of giftedness. Stewardship is a word that you hear from time to time, and often we don't pause long enough to think about what it actually means. And stewardship is very different than ownership. Ownership says, well, this is mine. Hands off. Stewardship says that there is something that I am in possession of, and I am a manager of it. I'm not an owner of it. I may be the possessor of it, the caretaker of it, but then that's going to go to somebody else at some point. That's true of, like, you don't own your time necessarily, and eventually you run out of it, and it goes to somebody else, your money, giftedness, all of these things. And so it's important to think through time, through money, through giftedness. Am I being a good steward of those? But today we're going to talk about something that we're all a part of, and that's this. We're all a part of families. I mean, the fact that you are here suggests that you had a birth, that you were born, and you are part of a family. And regardless of your position in that family, there is an extent to which you are not an owner of it, but a steward of it. And the question I want you to think about is this: am I a good steward of my family? Now, you could ask this question to any person. Go over, knock on a house or a door on Adam's farm and say, hey, are you a good steward of your family? And whoever you talk to may pause for a second and say, well, no, I am a good steward of my family because I love them, I try to provide for them, I watch out for them, they matter to me, I would sacrifice for them. Yeah, so I'm a good steward. But again, we're not just thinking about the answer to that question as a person, just as any part or any individual that's a part of a family, but we want to think about that specifically as a follower of Christ. Does my connection with Him affect, and should it affect, how I answer that question? I think it should. And I think more specifically, we ought to ask ourselves this: as a follower of Christ, am I a good steward of my family? Well, if it's more than do I care for them and love them and provide for them, what else do I need to be thinking about? Look with me in your Bibles today to Psalm 127. Psalm 127. As I think we're given a couple of questions that we can ask that help us think through the question itself of whether we are good stewards of our family. Psalm 127, likely you're familiar, or at least with parts of this. Verse 1 says, "Unless the Lord builds a house, its builders labor over it in vain. Unless the Lord watches over a city, the watchman stays alert in vain. In vain you get up early and stay up late, working hard to have enough food. Yes, He gives sleep to the one He loves. Sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons born in one's youth. Happy is the man who has filled his quiver with them. They will never be put to shame when they speak with their enemies at the city gate." Likely in reading this, you could say, I am not sure that I quite get it. And what does this have to do with the question at hand? And ultimately, I would say it helps us think through and answer that by providing us a couple of questions that we can ask. Am I a good steward of my family? Well, I think we need to ask this, based on what the psalmist says. First of all, to what extent is God part of the equation of my family? I mean, to what extent is God part of the equation? Now, many have read this psalm, or at least portions of it, over the years, or maybe some of you are seeing these words for the first time, and likely you would probably come away with the deduction, the conclusion, this is kind of a random stream of thoughts, just like, don't hit your mama with a great big stick, brush your teeth, and when the sun's out and it's raining, the devil's beating his wife. Completely having nothing to do with anything, that these are completely incongruous, unlinked thoughts. I believe, however, that all of these thoughts are linked, and it's appropriate that we are thinking about them as a completed text, as a psalm, because I believe they are all linked around and focused on the subject of family. And I think when you begin to think through that lens, then clarity begins to come out of some of the fogginess. After all, this is not a passage that is about construction, about operating as a security officer. It's not a passage about fertility. It's not a passage about sleeplessness. It's not about that. This is a passage that is about family, and you get that from how the beginning of this psalm starts, where it says, "Unless the Lord builds a house." Now, it's easy to see that, or see the word house and think, well, this is a structure, this is an edifice or of something, of some sort. But the word that is used conveys the idea of not just merely a building, but a household, that it's talking about family. He's saying, unless the Lord builds a house, the builders labor over it in vain. Unless the Lord watches over a city, the watchman stays alert in vain. What you see throughout this psalm is that the writer is using a series of metaphors. And what are metaphors? Metaphors are word pictures. They're word pictures. They're illustrations to help drive a point home. So, for example, if you say, that individual, they have a heart of stone. Well, you're not trying to say that inside of them is some sort of mineral deposit. That's not what you're meaning. You're saying that they don't care. They're void of emotion. They are indifferent to the plight and to the feelings of others. They don't care about anything. They have a heart of stone. It's just hard. It's not soft. They don't care at all. So that's a word picture. That's a metaphor. Here we've got metaphors here talking about a family being described as building something, and about individuals laboring over it in vain if the Lord is not part of the construction team. And then if you have this that has been constructed, that you would want to have individuals like with a city-state, you would want to have those that are keeping their eyes out for the enemy, that it would alert and to warn and to call people to action. And he says, unless the Lord is part of that, those that would be standing on post, that would be watching on guard, they are doing so in vain. What I believe the psalmist is seeking to drive home very simply is this point. If God is not meaningfully part of the equation of your life, not merely as an individual, but collectively as a family. I don't mean merely that you show up to church or that you say the blessing or sing happy birthday before you eat or whatever the case may be. But I mean meaningfully part of the equation of your family's life. He's saying that what you are doing in vain. Now, what does it mean to do something in vain? To do something in vain means that it's kind of useless. It's not of any real benefit. Sometimes we use the word vain to say, ooh, that person's so vain they like to look at themselves. But here the word is talking about something that has no real value. I believe that, in my opinion, and if I were running for office, maybe I would run for office on this, that I believe that fall happens at the wrong time of year. You say, well, what are you talking about? Well, here it is. We refer to it as fall, typically, more than we ever refer to it as autumn, because I think we associate that time of year with the falling of leaves, right? So I think fall happens at the wrong time of year. I think it should happen late July, August. You say, well, that's bizarre. Why would you say that? I say that because this time of year that we call fall, it's really windy. You notice that? And so during this time, and when these leaves are falling, it tends to be really windy. And so when these leaves are falling, we feel compelled, we've got to do something with them. We've got to rake them up and we've got to bag them up. We've got to haul them off to a natural area. We've got to haul them off to a dump. We've got to heap them in piles and burn them. We're going to do something with them. And likely you have had this experience multiple times over the years. You have gone out to rake your leaves, to blow the leaves, to cart the leaves, to bag the leaves, to do something with the leaves. And as you're doing that, you're out there and the wind is blowing. And if you're not paying attention, all of a sudden you're going to look back and you're going to think words that shouldn't be said in church. Why? Because the wind has blown down more leaves. In fact, you could have spent hours working on this, and when you're done, it doesn't look like you've actually done anything. Why can't the leaves fall when you get that hot stagnant air in July and August? That way we can get them up and there's no more that fall during that time. But when the wind comes, when it's blowing and you're trying to get these leaves up, the whole experience, all of that work is done oftentimes in what feels like in vain. No real benefit. It looks the same now that I'm done as it did when I started. All that effort and nothing really to show for it. Both by experience and in observation, it seems to me that families today are busier than they've ever been. I think it has to do not only with additional income, but it has to do with increasing technology. And the truth is, there's just so many more opportunities that exist now that didn't exist when some of you were young and growing up. There are so many activities that we can be a part of. Now, school has been around, and there's classes and homework and all that, and there's time that's got to be spent investing in that. But then beyond that, there are so many other activities. And sports have been around for a long time, but it seems like there's so many of them now. And it used to be, if you were to participate in a sport, it was only what happened at school, but now there's school, there's other athletic leagues, there's traveling teams, there's all of this stuff, and there's baseball, and there's football, and there's soccer, and there's basketball, there's there's volleyball, there's gymnastics, there's martial arts, there's variations of all of these things. Beyond that, there are stacks of musical opportunities, not merely at school, but outside of school, extracurricular. There's dance, there's theater, there are all sorts of civic organizations that not just adults, but even children and teens can be a part of. And that's to say nothing about the other responsibilities that demand our attention and that compete for our time just to keep a household, just to keep a family going, whether it's meals prepared or laundry done or bills paid, that type of stuff. We are being pulled and tugged, and we are so blessed busy. Families are busy, really, really busy. And many moms and dads are increasingly just tired, because you're trying to manage the essentials, but then there's all this other stuff where you're, in addition, operating as a cab driver. And so you're taking your kids to all of these things, and there's this practice, and there's this performance, and there's all of these things that are going on. And we need to pause long enough to ask this question: for what effect? To what end? Let me be blunt. It does not matter. Let me say it again. It does not matter if your kid can dribble a basketball, kick a soccer ball, bounce a volleyball, throw a baseball, strum a guitar, dance up a storm when they are lying on their deathbed. No one will be saying, "I am so glad that we exhausted ourselves making sure that Johnny could get to soccer practice. I am so glad that we spent all of that money so that they could learn to play Canon in D on the piano horribly." No, nobody's going to be saying that. Why? Because in the end, those things by comparison don't matter. But what does matter when that person is getting ready to leave this earth is what's getting ready to happen. As their time here has expired and they're getting ready to experience eternity, what really matters then? I'll tell you what really matters then. Whether they know and walk with Jesus, that's what really matters. Now, too many times, though, what occurs is that, and this is human nature, we tend to wait to evaluate performance. We tend to wait to evaluate activity once the opportunity or once that time has passed. And so we'll say, once this event is over, let's think about it and say, well, what worked, what didn't work? And many times in doing so, what we wind up doing is that we're not thinking about things before they happen, when it could actually be of consequence. I mean, honestly, this happens with money all the time. You know, so many individuals or families, they refuse to think about and use a budget because a budget is planning. But in truth, we're planning with money, whether we decide what we're going to do with it before we have it or decide what we do when we don't have any more of it. I mean, you're coming up with a plan. And too many times what we do is we try to come up with a plan after it's too late. And too many times there are parents and there are grandparents that are thinking, wait a minute, the season of meaningful influence is gone. That window has shut. And it's not that I'm absent from their life, but the role that I have in their life has diminished so significantly. And they're out on their own and they're doing all these things that I can't meaningfully influence. So, man, I wish. Leads us back to the question, what God has entrusted to my care with respect to my family, am I being a good steward of it? Well, I think how you answer that question should be based on whether or not it is that you have a personal relationship with Christ. If that is the case, it should be of consequence to you that God is part of the equation of your family's life. Listen, you know that I love some bluegrass, and we have gotten instruments, and I don't have any money, but I got nice instruments and a lot of lessons in the past. And I don't regret any of that. I'm grateful for all of this, and I'm grateful for the musical skill that the kids have developed. But I will tell you this, none of that matters. None of that investment is of any consequence if their lives have not been built with God as a meaningful part of the equation. Because they can pick and grin their way to hell. It matters if they know and walk with Jesus. The oversight and protection that I have been seeking to offer is of no consequence if my limited perspective is not superseded by what we're told here, that God as the watchman watching out for them. Whether or not I am a good steward of my family, I've got to ask this: to what extent is God part of the equation of my family's life? Now, I realize that we are all in different stages. Now, some are here today as teenagers, and like you're not a mom or a dad at this point, and so you're a teenager, and you're a part of a family, but you're not leading a family. Thinking about your role and your responsibility as part of including God in the routines and the conversation of life, you've got responsibility in that. As a parent, certainly you've got meaningful responsibility in that. And establishing parameters of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, what our family is going to do and what it's not going to do, what it is going to watch and what it's not going to watch, what we are going to talk about and what we are not going to talk about. Many of you are in that season of life right now, and you need to ask yourself, hey, is God a meaningful part of that? Some are further down the road, and your grandparents, or you are great-grandparents, or maybe God didn't bless you with children, and you've never been able to be a mom or a dad, but you have these family members, and you have nieces and nephews, and you have cousins. Listen, is it just getting together for Thanksgiving? Is it just talking about the weather? Is it just griping about the politicians at any particular point? Or is there something that actually matters? Hopefully, those of us who have come to know and experience the difference that Christ can make in the life of a person realize also that he can make a difference in the life of a family when he is part of the equation. Because if he's not, everything that we spend our time, all of that work, all of that effort, the psalmist says is in vain. It doesn't have lasting value. It doesn't have lasting value. Second question I believe we're presented with is this: am I operating with spiritual aims for my children? Am I operating with spiritual aims for my children? Obviously, I think this has direct application for those that are in the active stages of parenting, but there are all sorts of derivatives for those that are grandparents, great-grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all of that. But am I thinking about my children with spiritual aims? Now, even though there are just 5 verses, in no way do we have time to unpack fully what the psalmist says here. But I want you to go to verse 3 where he says that sons are indeed a heritage. Some of your translations may say an inheritance from the Lord, offspring a reward. Now, heritage and inheritance both are acceptable translations and decent translations of that word. But it means more than just inheritance. So, for example, my grandmother on my dad's side, she dipped 2 bros snuff. And after she died, my cousin got her spittoon. I guess you could say that was her inheritance. Yay. I got grandma's brass spit container. That's a lousy inheritance. When this says inheritance, it's conveying the idea of the receipt of something of meaningful value, not just anything. It's not that I got grandma's pencil, but there is something actually of value. And this tells us that God brings children into the lives of parents, and they are a reward. They are a blessing. God is passing on that which is of meaning and value. And those of you who are parents can attest to that. And you know, even though your kids may press all of your buttons at the same time or at various times, and there are days that are difficult, and there's exhaustion, there's expense, and there's all of those things, there's probably not a person in this room that if the choice was between your life and theirs, you would say, let them live. You'd give your life for them. Why? Because they're so valuable to you. But then we see this in verse 4, like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons born in one's youth. Again, you've got metaphors constantly. So now children are described as an inheritance, and then now they're described as like arrows in the hand of a warrior. When it says, are the sons born in one's youth, I am really relishing that. We're too old for this. Anyway, but it's not saying it's good or children are a blessing if you have them before age 25. It's just appealing to the fact that we have the capacity of having children at a younger season in life. That's what it's appealing to. But they are described as arrows, and arrows are put into a quiver. That's what you would have on your back to hold all of these arrows. Happy is the man who has filled his quiver with them. Now, very easily you could look at this and say, well, this is an encouragement to have more children. And if that's the case, then Caroline and I, we have checked that box, I feel like. This has, I believe, application with respect to family size. And I'll just be blunt. We don't have time to unpack this thought. If there's anybody that ought to be having a stack of kids, it's Christians. It is. And if anybody should be producing the next generation, it should be those that know and walk with the Lord. That's a conversation for later. Children here, though, they are likened to arrows. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. Happy is the man whose quiver is full of them. It's not accidental that children are described here as arrows because, and they're not just talking about arrows with respect to hunting. I mean, this is thinking about the use of an arrow in terms of battle, of conflict. Now, you're aware that we fight differently today. I mean, because of technology. And I guess if this verse were written today, it might say, that children are likened to bullets, and it's great if your magazine is full of bullets as you're engaged in warfare. But it's described as arrows, and I think that's consequential on two levels. One, because it's given to us in the context of struggle, in the context of warfare. Let me just remind you, as a follower of Christ, yes, you are following Him, but you also have a real enemy who has you in his crosshairs. And Paul tells us that we wrestle not against flesh and blood. My enemy is not somebody else. My ultimate enemy, we're told, is that we struggle against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this age, against spiritual wickedness in high places. There is a spiritual war that is going on that is unseen, but it is absolutely real. And you are under assault as a follower of Christ. And Satan and his minions and all those that are connected with him have you in their sights. There is a war that is going on. And he describes here that children are like an arrow in a war. What war? I believe it's that spiritual conflict that's in view. Now, with respect to fighting, even in that day, obviously you didn't have some of the many tools that we have today by virtue of increased technology. But if you were going to go into fighting or into some sort of conflict, there's a number of things that you might like to have. You'd like to have probably a sword, maybe a spear, maybe a knife, a dagger, or something. Because when it gets up close and personal, you don't have time to say, well, you stand right there, let me pull this arrow. Because an arrow requires some space. It's more of a long distance thing. Once it gets to be up close and personal, you're looking for a club, a stick, a spear, a knife, a sword, something up close and personal. A arrow is more of a long range weapon. It's shot from back here, off in the distance. In that context, I believe it is important to realize the psalmist is thinking about children as part of that process, and that the greatest resource, the greatest weapon that you have in this spiritual struggle are children that will be able to continue the fight long after you have left. I've been pastoring since 2001, and in that time, I have preached thousands of sermons. I have preached hundreds of funerals. I have done weddings. I have engaged in more conversations on a personal level than I could begin to count. Made thousands of in-home and hospital visits. I have participated in thousands of services and Bible studies and small group and large group and prayer times and all of these things. And about that experience, a couple of things are true. First of all, not every moment was wonderful. There have been some times that were less than those that would put on a smile on your face. There have been some tough moments, but those have been very much blips on the radar screen because, in truth, I have loved ultimately every moment of this. The work that God's called me to, I am so grateful, and I have loved it. And I hope you can see I enjoy the work that God's called me to. That really is that's the honest truth. Beyond that, it's not merely that I have enjoyed what I have done, but if my ministry, if my life ends today, I would hope that there is, in the assessment of my service, there would be those that would say, you know, God was able to use Michael to have some impact on me. God was able to use Michael to help me think through some stuff and understand God's Word better. Maybe some would say, hey, Michael was the guy that pointed me in Christ's direction. Somebody else would say, hey, I appreciated the counsel that he gave, and that was part of what God did in saving our marriage. Who knows? And then I would be so grateful that those things could be said, that these years of service have had some consequence. But I am under no other assumption, no other desire than to realize this: the extent to which my life will have kingdom investment has nothing to do with the church. The greatest kingdom investment my life has nothing to do with Gate City Baptist, has nothing to do with Southern Baptist Convention life, has nothing to do with those things. But it has everything to do with 6 children. The greatest legacy that I have in the kingdom are 5 boys and a girl that we have been pouring into to do our level best to ensure that they are lifelong followers of Christ. And the extent to which that is able to exponentially grow kingdom impact cannot be overstated. Realizing that has caused us to operate with real spiritual aims for our kids. Yes, I want them to learn math and to learn to use proper English. And I want them to be able to think through problems and to be able to earn a living and to get a job and get out of my house. And there's all of these things that I do, like any parent, that I have these desires for them. And I want them to be healthy, and I want them to be safe, and I want them to experience happiness. I do want all of those things. Any reasonable parent does. But listen, none of that stuff matters to me if my children do not know and walk with Him. Because that is the greatest consequence that my life for kingdom impact is ever going to have. And so I am thinking with the end in view. And if they are the greatest weapon that I have, well, that's going to affect how I do some stuff. It's going to affect what we prioritize. It's going to affect what we put higher on the ladder. It's going to affect what we put lower on the ladder. Am I a good steward of my family? None of us is perfect. In fact, that's probably how everybody saved alike, connected to the church, completely disconnected. Well, I'm not a perfect parent. None of us is a perfect parent. That goes without saying. Most people would say, am I a good steward of my family? Yeah, well, I love them. I provide for them. I would sacrifice for them. Yeah, hopefully that's true of you. But is there anything more? As a follower of Christ, are you a good steward of your family? I mean, to what extent then is God involved in the equation of your family's life? Do you actually have spiritual aims for your children? As this rubber meets the road type of subject applies to personal application, I've done this each week, let me give you a few questions to answer. The first is this: do the goals I have for my family look any different than those who don't know Christ? Whatever your role is in your family, do you have goals that are any different than those who don't know Christ? Secondly, to what extent, if any, is God involved in the routines and the conversations of my family? In the routines and the conversations of my family, to what extent is God ever involved in that? Am I making investments in my family that have any spiritual or kingdom consequence? And finally, have I better equipped my children, my grandchildren, my nieces, my nephews, whatever? Have I, to the extent that I have that opportunity, equipped them better or to be better athletes, musicians, students, employees, or followers of Jesus? Not simply are you a good steward of your family, but as a follower of Christ, are you a good steward? Will you bow your heads with me?